everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I'm doing a series review of the Daevabad Trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, which includes City of Brass, Kingdom of Copper, and Empire of Gold, as well as a short story collection set in this world that is called The River of Silver. These books are incredibly shiny, so I'm gonna have to see if I can set them up so that they're not just like reflecting the entire time. Okay, I got one of them set up. These books are also very floppy, so I couldn't get all three of them to stand up at once. But I got the first one, and that's what matters for this. Okay, so the Daevabad Trilogy is a fantasy series that is that starts out in 18th century Cairo. In it, we start out following Nahri, who is a con woman, and her actual dream is to become a doctor, but at this time, women are not able to be doctors, and so in order to survive, she cons people. We start off the story where she is doing a ritual as part of a con. She's not expecting anything to come from this because she doesn't believe that magic exists, but she ends up accidentally summoning a Jinn warrior who then quickly whisks her away to the magical city of Daevabad. So Daevabad is this magical city where different magical beings exist that is unknown to the human world. And so the Jinn warrior takes her there because she is also magical. And when she gets there, she's just kind of like thrown into the middle of a very complicated political situation that is happening. There are different factions that are all vying against each other. There's also a group of people who have been oppressed for many years, and there's a rebellion brewing. So it's a very complicated situation that she just kind of gets like thrown into the middle of. We're following three main perspectives in this, one of which is Nahri, who provides this kind of just outside perspective as she is first getting introduced to this world. We also are following Dara, who is that Jinn warrior. He has a very dark and complicated past because as a Jinn who has been trapped and enslaved, he has been forced to do some very terrible things, kill a lot of people, and it has really taken its toll on him and has also made people very fearful of him. And then the third character that we're following is Ali, who is the second son of, is he a king or an emperor? He's the second son of the current ruler of Daevabad, and Ali has been trained kind of as like a spiritual warrior. Like, he has been trained very much steeped in the religion of this world, but also as a warrior, as he is meant to like lead the warriors of his brother when his brother eventually succeeds their father. So we're following these three perspectives, and I think Ali was probably my favorite perspective to follow, followed very closely by Nahri. Like, they were my top two. I was not as into Dara as a character. Like, I understand his character and why he is the way that he is, but I just felt like he was not as compelling to read about as the other two. And so as we kind of would cycle through their point of view chapters, I always was a little like less excited about Dara's chapters, but I really loved both Ali and Nahri, and not because they were perfect. They are certainly flawed characters, but I just found them very interesting and compelling to read about. I think that sort of relates to one of the things that I loved most about this series was getting to understand these characters and their different perspectives and, you know, their motivations, why they're doing what they're doing. What I really loved about this, what I think that S.A. Chakraborty did so successfully in this series, was really getting you to understand the perspective of every character that we follow, every side of the situation. You understood why each side and each character did what they did, but you also understood why other characters hated them for doing that. Like every side of this kind like made sense to a certain extent. Like you understood the perspective and motives and like the lens with which they were seeing and understanding this world. And I just loved how complicated that made things, both politically complicated, it was very emotionally complicated for these characters. I really think that's the thing that I loved most about this. Other than just, I also really enjoyed the characters. I loved the relationships in this. There is a bit of a love triangle in it. The love triangle is not the center of the story. The story is very much more focused on the politics, but there is a bit of a love triangle. I felt pretty ambivalent about it, partially because there was definitely one ship that I cared about a lot more than the other one, and the love triangle resolved in a way that I was happy with, so it worked out for me. I know some people really hate love triangles just on principle, so it kind of depends. Depends for you how you feel about love triangles. I'm generally pretty ambivalent about them as long as they're done pretty well, and I generally liked this one. But yeah, I just really enjoyed all of the characters and perspectives and so much about this. Sort of related to that is that this book also has healing magic in it, which I love healers in books, whether it is practical healing, like actual, medically healing people, or healing magically. I don't care. I'm all in for healers. And I didn't know that going into this book. I didn't know that there was a healer character in this. And if I had known, I was like, why did no one tell me this? If I had known, I would have read this way sooner. But I just loved that aspect of it. I think we get more of it as the series goes on and as the character kind of gets more comfortable with their healing magic, but I still feel like it could have been more a part of the story, but maybe that's just me because it's a trope that I love. With this series, I actually almost didn't continue on with the series after the first book, which I'm very glad now that I did, because the first book, I liked it, but I didn't love it. I know that for a lot of people, they are like in love with the series from page one. For me, it was just okay in the first book. And I almost didn't continue on, except that I happened to already have the second book because somebody gave it to me. And now I'm really glad that I did continue on with the series because it was so good. The second book had kind of a slow start for the first third or half of it, but the second half of the second book was incredible and was really my favorite part probably of the entire series, was the second half of the second book, which to some extent, I don't want to be one of those people who's like, oh, you just have to get through a book and a half in order for it to get good. But to me personally, it was definitely worth it. As I said, some people love the series from the get-go, so they won't have that experience of having to get a book and a half in before they enjoy it. But for me, I did have to kind of get a book and a half in before I really loved it. But the amount that I loved it after that point was 100% worth it. I loved it so much. I will say that there were some parts of the world building, I guess, that were a little bit confusing to me, especially telling the difference between some of the different magical beings that there were, especially the Jinn, the Deva, and the Ifrit. I couldn't always, I'm not totally clear on what the difference between them is. I knew who the Marid were because they're very different from everybody else. But the other three, I had a little bit of a hard time telling the difference between them. There is a glossary in the back of the book that kind of explains the difference, and I read it a couple of times, and yet somehow that information still didn't stick. It could be because when I read this series, I was actually listening to the audiobooks, and so sometimes for me, when there are more complex stories, sometimes there will be little details that I miss if I'm listening to the audiobook. But I don't feel like this was because of the audiobook, because I have talked to other people who have read the book physically and were also confused by the difference between these different people. So for me, I just kind of went like, I'll figure it out. You know, I would always just sort of figure out from context clues, and like I understood who the different like factions were and the different sides. I just didn't totally get the difference between like a Deva and a Jinn and an Ifrit. But there are also glossaries, so if it's something that's like important to you to really like fully understand, that information is there. But as I said, overall, loved this series. I think also these books did also like really would end with a bang, you know, or would end with a cliffhanger or end with a real showdown. So I would love like the endings of these books. And I just like had such a great time with the series. And then there's also the short story collection that goes along with it, which has short stories just that take place in the same world. One of the things that I like about the structure of the collection is that she tells you before each story where where chronologically this lands. So is this like 20 years before the first book, or is this take place between the second and third books? So that was really helpful. And then also before each story she'll put in like spoiler warnings for like, oh, this has spoilers for the second book. So you can decide when to read that short story. Personally, I read the collection after having completed the full trilogy, so the spoilers didn't really matter to me, but I just like that about the way that she set up the collection. I also found that some of the stories, you know, in the collection I enjoyed more than others, which is kind of always the case. Like overall, it was a nice short story collection, especially just because, you know, it's already in a familiar world that I already cared about. I think that some of the short stories I was less interested in just because they were either about characters that I was less interested in, or they were about characters that we hadn't met before. And then the stories that I really liked the most were the ones that were about the characters that I already know and love from the rest of the series, and just kind of giving more backstory or fleshing things out, or just giving us those moments that didn't get captured in the novels. Especially that we got more about Jamshid and Muntadir. I really like both of their characters, especially Jamshid, and we got some short stories about them, and I just really enjoyed seeing more about their characters. So I loved this series. I think I gave every book in this series either 4 or 4.5 stars, and I am so excited to read more from this author, but I'd love to know if you have read this series, what you thought of it, who's your favorite character, because now that I remember Jamshid, like I loved his character too. So I feel like Ali, Jamshid, and Nahri are like my top characters. That's a lot of the characters, but I loved them. Anyways, I'd love to know who your favorite characters were, was your favorite part of the books. But thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!